They struck Verity Ash's name from the rolls on the coldest morning of the year, and they made her kneel on the frozen flagstones and watch the ink dry. Verity of the line of Ash, the registrar read, and his voice carried across the muster yard of High Cairn without any effort at all, because 500 wolves had stopped breathing to hear it. Rejected at the bonding stone, unclaimed for 5 winters, barren of issue by the finding of the pack midwife. He turned the great vellum page with 2 fingers, the way a man turns something he does not want on his hands. By the authority of the Concord of Rolls, her line is closed. Her name is struck. She is unlined. The scribe drew the black bar through her name. Verity watched him do it. She watched the nib bite, watched the ink pool at the end of the stroke, and sit there glossy as a beetle's back. And she thought, absurdly, that it was a great deal of ink to spend on a laundress. "Stand," said Registrar Selwyn Ambrose. She stood. Her knees had gone past pain into a distant ringing numbness, and the cold came up through the thin soles of her boots and settled in her hips. She was 26 years old. She had been kneeling since the bells rang at dawn. "Have you anything to say before the rolls are closed?" That was the cruelty of it. He always asked. He asked because the answer was already written, because a woman who protested proved the finding, and a woman who stayed silent consented to it. And either way, Selwyn Ambrose ended the morning with a clean page and a tidy column. Verity looked past him. The muster yard of High Cairn was a bowl of grey stone cut into the shoulder of the mountain, and the crowd stood in it, the way water stands in a bowl, filling every level. The high families on the eastern terrace, in their marten and their oiled wool. The betas of the middle terraces with their arms folded, and at the bottom, in the churned brown snow where she knelt, the unlined, the widowed, the mateless, the crippled, the shamed, herded in close so they could watch what became of the newest one of them. She found the faces she expected: Lady Corvin, who had employed her mother; the tanner's foreman, who would put her on the lye vats by afternoon because a struck name cost half a wage; and behind them, half hidden by the arch of the gate, a young woman in the slate-gray sash of the bond warden's clerks, watching Verity with an expression that did not belong on the face of anyone who was enjoying this. "Nothing," Verity said. "I have nothing to say." "Then it is done." Selwyn closed the book, and that would have been the end of her. The whole of it, a bar of ink, and a walk back down the switchback road to the wash houses. Except that at that exact moment the passing bell began to ring in the tower above the keep, and it rang the pattern that meant a death in the ruling house, and every wolf in that yard forgot Verity Ash existed. 9 strokes. A pause. 9 strokes again. Not a death, a dying. And 9 was the count for a pup. Verity heard a woman on the terrace make a sound like a chair leg dragged on stone. She heard Selwyn Ambrose, close enough that no one else could have caught it, breathe out through his nose. A small, satisfied, entirely private sound. The sound of a man watching a long sum come out even. She would remember that sound for the rest of her life. The heir of High Cairn was 4 years old, and he was dying by inches, and the whole pack had watched it happen for 11 weeks. His name was Bram Halloway. He was the son of Corin Halloway, the Alpha King's younger brother, dead these 3 years under a rockfall on the Merrow Pass Road, along with his wife Ilsa. He was the last of the direct line. He had been, by every account Verity had ever heard from the kitchen girls, an ordinary loud small boy who liked to hide under the long table in the great hall and bite the ankles of visiting lords. And then in the spring he had stopped eating, and in the summer he had stopped growing, and by autumn he had stopped speaking. And now in the deep of winter he lay in the North Tower and did not open his eyes. They called it the fading. There was no medicine for it. There had been 3 physicians from the mainland, and a bone setter from the southern packs, and a woman who claimed to draw sickness out through the soles of the feet, and a delegation of registry healers who had bled him twice and left. There had been 100 silver marks spent on a sanctum bell that was supposed to shake the illness loose from the small bones of his chest. There had been prayers. There had been, lately, whispers of poison. And the whispers had names attached. And the names changed depending on who was whispering. None of it mattered. The pup went on fading. Verity heard about it the way she heard about everything, which was with her arms in gray water up to the elbow. The wash house at High Cairn sat behind the kitchens, a low vaulted room with a stone channel running through it, and 6 copper vats above 6 fires. And in winter the steam came off the vats and froze on the ceiling and fell back down again as a fine, warm sleet. She had worked there since she was 21. She would work there until her hands gave out. The lye had already taken the prints off 3 of her fingers and left the skin there shiny and blank as candle wax. "They're burning the linens now," said Marta Ives, hauling a basket in from the yard. "Every day, all of it. Sheets, shifts, bandages, straight into the pit." "Wasteful," said someone. "It's the plague fear." Marta dropped the basket. "Nobody'll carry to the North Tower anymore. 2 of the chamber girls ran off to their mothers in Blackfen. The steward's offering double coin, and there's still no takers." Verity kept scrubbing. She was aware of the silence spreading behind her, the way you are aware of a draft under a door. "Ash," said Marta carefully, "you're struck. You've no line to spoil." "That's right. So there's no contagion can shame you, is what I'm saying. And there's double coin." Verity looked up. The women in the wash house were all looking at her, not unkindly, most of them, but with the particular practical clarity of people deciding which of them was cheapest to risk. She had known most of them since childhood. Ada there had shared her bread the winter her mother died. That was the thing nobody outside understood about the Unlined. It was not that the pack hated you. It was that you became the obvious answer to certain questions. "How much is double?" Verity said. She went up at dusk with a hamper of clean linen on her hip and a guard walking 6 paces ahead of her, which was 6 paces further than any guard usually walked from anyone. The North Tower stair was 91 steps. She counted them, because counting kept her from thinking about what waited at the top, which was a room where a child was dying, and Verity Ash had made a private religion out of never being in a room with a dying child. 5 years ago, she had been in one. She had been 21 and enormous and terrified, and the midwife Nessa Fenn had put a rag soaked in something bitter over her mouth and said, "Breathe, girl, breathe. It's easier this way." And Verity had gone down into a black soft place with no bottom to it. When she came up, it was 2 days later, and the room smelled of vinegar, and Nessa Fenn would not look at her, and there was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth on the table by the window. The frost took him, Nessa had said. He never drew breath. "It's a mercy you didn't see." They had not let her open it. They had told her opening it would break her. She had buried it herself on the Scree slope above Coldwater, because the Unlined were not permitted the pack ground. And she had dug the hole with a coal shovel through 4 inches of frozen crust, and when she lifted the bundle to lower it in, it had not felt like a child. It had felt like what it was. Like stones. She had told herself for 5 years that grief plays tricks with weight. 91 steps. At the top, the guard stopped and turned his face away and said, "Go on then." And Verity went on. The room was very warm, and it smelled wrong. Not of sickness. That was the first thing that struck her, and it struck her hard. She had smelled sick rooms. Sick rooms smelled of sour bodies and old broth and the sweetish rot of a wound going bad. This room smelled of clean beeswax and cedar smoke, and underneath, faintly, of nothing at all. Of absence, of the way a house smells when the family has been gone a year. There were 2 women in it. One was a registry healer in the black-piped gray of the Concord, asleep in a chair with a ledger open on her knee. The other was a nurse who took one look at Verity's hands, the shiny blank fingertips, the lye scald to the wrist, and understood immediately who and what she was, and left the room without a word. And there was the bed. It was a great carved thing meant for an adult, and the boy in it took up so little of it that at first Verity's eye slid past him entirely. He lay on his back with his arms outside the covers. His hair was dark and damp and had been combed by somebody who loved him, parted neatly on the left. His face had the particular translucence of a child who has stopped eating. The skin gone fine, the shadows under the eyes not gray, but faintly blue. The lips slightly open. His chest rose, held, fell. A long time later, rose again. Verity set the hamper down and did not move for a while. She had promised herself she would put the linen on the chest, take her coin, and go. That was the arrangement. That was what a sensible woman did. But there was a smell in the room after all, she realized. A thin thread of it under the beeswax, warm and particular. The way a bread oven smells when the fire has just been raked out. It went through her like a nail. She crossed to the bed before she had decided to. The registry healer slept on. The fire popped. Verity stood over the boy and looked down at him, and her heart was doing something painful and irregular, and she told herself it was only the stair, only the 91 steps, only that she was 26 years old and had not stood this close to a small child since the Scree slope above Coldwater. His left hand lay open on the coverlet. There was a mark on the back of it, low near the wrist, and Verity had seen that mark before. Not a birthmark exactly. A pale hook, a small curved line with a tail like a fish hook, or like the sign the cloth dyers of Blackfen used to stamp a bolt as flawed. Her mother had one. In the same place, on the same hand. Verity had one. She turned her own wrist over without meaning to, and there it was, half eaten by lye-scald, but there, the pale hook, the tail. No, she said out loud. The healer stirred and did not wake. Verity's ears were roaring. She was doing arithmetic she did not want to do. 5 winters, 4 years, the drugged dark, the bundle that weighed like stones, Nessa Fen who would not look at her. And every number came out the same, and the room tipped, and she put one hand on the bedpost to keep her feet. The boy's chest rose, held. It did not fall. She waited. It did not fall. The silence went on, and it had a shape, and the shape was the rest of her life. And Verity Ash did the only thing she had ever wanted to do in that other room 5 years ago, and had never been allowed. She leaned down over the bed, and she put one lye-ruined hand against the side of a dying child's face, and she kissed him on the forehead. His skin was cool and faintly salt. She held there. She said against him, so quietly that it was barely air, "I'm sorry I was so late." 3 things happened at once. The fire in the grate flattened, not out but down, as though a great slow breath had been drawn through the room, and the flames lay along the coals like grass in wind. Frost went across the inside of the window in one running instant, from the sill to the lintel, with a sound like sand poured on a drum, and the boy in the bed took a breath. A real one. A deep, greedy, ragged, whooping breath. The kind a swimmer takes coming up, and his back arched off the mattress, and his fingers closed hard on the coverlet, and the registry healer came out of her chair screaming. Verity did not move. She could not. Because as the boy turned his head, the collar of his nightshirt fell away from his nape. And there, rising up out of the white skin in a slow bloom of red, as though a hand were writing it from underneath, came a mark, a hook, with a tail. And through the tail, a running thread, the ash line mark, the mark that was struck out of the rolls that morning in a bar of black ink, in front of 500 people, on the coldest day of the year. The healer's screaming had brought boots on the stair. A great many boots coming fast, taking the 91 steps 2 and 3 at a time, and over them a voice giving orders in the flat, carrying way of a man who has never in his life had to repeat himself. The door came off the latch. The Alpha King of Cairn filled the doorway with his shoulders and a spear in his fist. Verity had seen Roderick Halloway perhaps a dozen times in her life, always from the wrong end of a crowd. A big dark-haired man on a terrace, a signature, a profile on the pack seal. Up close, he was younger than the seal made him, and worse-looking than the stories. 3 days unshaven, gray in the hollows under his eyes. A burn scar on the back of his right hand from the night they had tried the sanctum bell. He had come from the muster armory. He had come at a run because someone had told him the healer was screaming in his nephew's room, and there was only one reason he could imagine for that. The spear he carried was old, ash-hafted. There were 2 letters burned into the wood below the socket, and the wood around them was worn pale and smooth from years of a hand closing over the same spot. He saw the boy sitting up in the bed with his eyes open. He saw the frost on the window. He saw a laundress with wrecked hands standing over his heir with her mouth still an inch from the child's forehead, and the mark burning red on the back of the child's neck. Roderick Halloway's face did something Verity had no name for. And then the Alpha King opened his hand, and his brother's spear fell on the stone floor and rolled, rattling, until it struck the leg of the bed and stopped. "Say that name again," he said hoarsely. "The one you just said. Say it again." But behind him in the stairwell, breathing hard, with the great vellum book of the rolls still clutched under one arm as though he had not set it down all day, Registrar Selwyn Ambrose had arrived, and he had gone the color of tallow, and he was not looking at the king, or at the boy, or at the mark. He was looking at the window, and the frost, and the empty place on the wall where a page from a certain sealed record ought to have hung. "Take her," Selwyn said. "Take her now, and gag her before she speaks." They did not gag her. Otho Kemp, the king's spear captain, had been a soldier for 31 years and had learned early that the fastest way to end a career was to obey the second loudest man in a room. He looked at Selwyn Ambrose. He looked at Roderick Halloway, who had not taken his eyes off the woman by the bed and had not picked his spear back up. Then he took Verity by the upper arm, gently, the way you take a horse's bridle, and said, "Come along, mistress," and walked her out past the registrar without any gag at all. They put her in the Muniment Room under the keep, which was not a cell but had a door that locked and no window, and which smelled so strongly of vellum and cedar oil and iron gall that her eyes ran for the first quarter hour. Shelves went up all 4 walls into the dark. Somewhere above her, a floorboard creaked and creaked, the same 4 paces, the sound of a large man walking a small distance for a long time. She sat on a stool with her wrecked hands in her lap, and did not weep, because weeping was a thing you did when there was somebody to hear it. And she said the arithmetic to herself again and again like a rosary. 5 winters since the bonding stone. 4 years and some months since the room that smelled of vinegar. A pale hook with a tail on the back of a small left hand. It's a mercy you didn't see. The lock turned at the 3rd hour past midnight. Roderick Halloway came in alone, ducking the lintel, carrying a lamp and a stoppered jug, and he shut the door behind him and stood with his back against it, as though he were the one who needed a wall. "He's awake," he said. He asked for water. He drank a full cup, and then he asked whether it was still summer. He set the lamp on a shelf. "It is not still summer. He has lost half a year." Verity said nothing. "He hasn't spoken since the feast of the long night. 11 weeks. The king's voice was perfectly level, and something underneath it was not level at all. The mainland physician told me to prepare the pack. The registry healers told me to prepare a successor. I have spent 11 weeks preparing to bury the last of my brother's blood." He crossed to her, pulled a second stool from under the table, and sat down on it. A big man on a small seat, elbows on his knees, so that his eyes were below hers. She had not expected that. Nothing in 5 years had prepared her for a man of rank, arranging himself lower than she was. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm a laundress." "You are not a laundress. This morning you were something else, and something was taken from you in front of 500 people. And I stood on that terrace and let it happen, because it was a registry matter, and registry matters are not mine." He turned his hands over. There was ink on them. He had been in the archive. "Your name?" "Verity Ash." "Ash." He repeated it the way a man repeats a word in a language he half knows. "Say the rest." "Rejected at the bonding stone," the registrar said. "By whom?" She looked at him for a long moment. "By your brother," she said. "By Corin Holloway, 5 winters ago, at the second thaw, in front of the pack." The floorboard above them had stopped creaking. In the silence, Verity could hear the lamp. She told him because there was no longer any version of the night in which she got to keep it. She had been 21, a dyer's assistant then, before the lie, with hands still good enough to be trusted with white linen. She had gone up to the spring muster with a bolt of cloth on her shoulder, and no expectation of anything at all, and a young man on the steps of the counting house had turned around because of her scent, and had gone absolutely still. That was how it happened, for wolves. There was no ceremony to it. There was a stairwell and a stranger going still. "He was kind," she said. "That's the part nobody believes, so I'll say it first. He was kind. He was funny in a way that made him unpopular with serious people. He carried the cloth for me and pretended it was heavy. 4 months. A winter of it. Mostly in the old dye sheds at Coldwater where nobody came after dark. Corin Holloway, brother to the Alpha King, and Verity Ash of the Blackfen dyers, whose line was in the rolls but only just. He said he'd stand up at the bonding stone at the second thaw and claim me in front of the pack and let them all choke on it," she said. "He meant it when he said it. I've had 5 years to decide whether he meant it, and I've decided he did." "And at the second thaw?" He stood up. Her voice did not change. And he said the words of rejection instead. All of them. He didn't stumble once. He'd learned them. Roderick closed his eyes briefly. "I was there," he said. "I remember an omega on the stone. I remember thinking it was badly done and being glad when it was over." He opened his eyes. "I didn't know your name. I want to be clear about that, because I could tell you I didn't know and let you assume I would have stopped it. I don't know that I would have. My brother's marriage to Ilsa Merrow was signed 4 days later, and it brought the Merrow charters into the house, and I was glad of the charters." Verity found to her own annoyance that she believed him. "And the child," Roderick said. "There it was." "They told me he was born dead," Verity said. "The pack midwife, Nessa Fenn. She gave me something bitter on a rag and I went under. And when I came up, it was 2 days later, and there was a bundle on the table. They wouldn't let me open it. I buried it above Coldwater with a coal shovel." She looked at the lie-blank tips of her fingers. It weighed nothing. I've told myself for 5 years that grief makes things weigh nothing. Corin was already wed by then. Yes. And Ilsa was already carrying by the registry's finding. Roderick's voice had gone slow and careful. A man walking out onto ice. The heir was recorded born on the 9th of the cold moon, delivered by Nessa Fenn, witnessed by the bond warden's office, sealed by Ambrose. "Yes," said Verity. "And I buried a bag of stones on the 14th. He did not shout. That was the thing she would think about afterward, that he sat there on the low stool with his ruined hands hanging and he did not shout or draw or send for anyone, or tell her she was a liar, all of which he was entitled to do, and any of which would have ended her. He said, "Show me the mark." She turned her wrist over. He took her hand in both of his and tilted it toward the lamp, and his thumb passed over the shiny blank place where a fingerprint used to be and stopped. "What did this?" "Lie. It's the vats." "How long does that take?" 4 years. 5. He put her hand down very carefully, as though it might be evidence, which it was. Then he stood and pulled a brass-cornered ledger off the second shelf and laid it open on the table under the lamp. "This is the roll of issue for the year of the cold moon," he said. "I brought it down an hour ago. The registrar does not know I have it, and by morning he will. So look now." She came and stood at his shoulder. The roll was beautiful, in the way of things made to overawe. Heavy vellum, ruled in red, every entry in the same disciplined hand with the line mark of the mother drawn in the left margin like a little illustration in a herbal. Birth. Line. Witness. Seal. Page after page of the pack's blood, tallied like grain. The 9th of the cold moon was not there. Between the 8th and the 10th there was a stub, a bare quarter-inch of vellum still gripped in the binding, cut so cleanly that the edge was smooth as a blade under her fingertip. Someone had taken a razor to the gutter and lifted an entire leaf out of the book. And on the stub, in the left margin where the line mark went, a fraction of a drawing survived. The bottom of a curve, the beginning of a tail. "Hook," said Roderick. "Hook," said Verity. Old Hester Quill had been keeper of the High Cairn archive for 40 years and had outlasted 3 registrars, and she came down at dawn in a shawl over her nightgown with her hair in a grey rope down her back and told the Alpha King to move his elbow off the vellum. She looked at the stub for a long time with a lens. "Razor," she said. "Set in a handle, drawn from the head down. 2 strokes. Done by somebody who has cut a page out of a book before and knew to leave the stub so the gathering wouldn't loosen and betray the theft." She sniffed. "That is a professional erasure, my lord. That is not a panic." "How long ago?" "The cut edge hasn't yellowed under the binding. 2 years. 3 at the outside." Hester set the lens down. "Which means the page was in this book, whole and legible, for a year or more after the birth. Somebody took it out later. Somebody who wanted it gone, but wanted it kept." Verity said, "Why keep it?" Hester Quill looked at her with the frank interest of a woman who had spent 40 years around documents and very little time around people. "Child," she said. "In my trade, we call that a hostage." They moved her that morning, from the Muniment Room to a chamber off the North Tower stair, with a guard on the door and a fire and clean water, and no explanation offered to anyone. By the 3rd day, the whole of High Cairn knew that the unlined laundress had gone up the tower, and that the heir had opened his eyes, and the versions being told in the wash-house had already grown wings. The versions were not important. What was important was this. Bram Halloway was awake when Verity was in the room, and he faded when she was not. They discovered it the way you discover anything, which is by accident, and then by cruelty. On the 2nd day, the healers wanted her gone so they could work. She was taken down at noon, and by dusk the boy was gray and silent again, and his breath had gone back to that terrible held rhythm. They brought her up at the 9th hour, and within a quarter of an hour he was asking for bread. On the 4th day, Roderick made her stay away for 6 hours to be certain, and stood in the doorway the whole time with his jaw set like a man holding a door shut against water. And afterward, he went out into the muster yard alone and put his fist through a boarded window. "It isn't a sickness," Hester Quill said, on the 5th night, with the 3 of them around the table in the archive and the lamp burning down. "It never was. You've been physicking a child for a broken tether. Say it plainly. Plainly." The old woman folded her hands. "What do you think the naming does, my lord? At the 9th day, when the registrar holds a pup up and speaks the mother's line into the roll, and the scribe draws the line mark in the margin. What do you think it is? A record. That is what they tell you now." Hester's mouth thinned. 200 years ago, the Concord of Rolls was a guild of scribes with one very great idea. If you are the only house permitted to write down who a wolf's mother was, then in time nobody can be anybody without you. The naming isn't a record. It's an anchor. A pup's wolf takes hold of the maternal line the way ivy takes hold of stone. And what it takes hold of is the name spoken and written true. Write it false. And the ivy finds nothing, Verity said. "And grows a while on air," said Hester, because a pup is strong and a lie takes years to bite. And then in the 4th year or the 5th, when the wolf begins to come up in the child and reaches for its line and closes on nothing at all, the child begins to fade. She looked at the king. There is a word for it in the old rolls. They wrote it the Unmothering. It was struck from the vocabulary in your grandfather's time by a registrar named Ambrose. Roderick had gone very still. And the kiss, he said. A true name said true at the brow, by the woman whose line it is. Hester shrugged with one shoulder. It's not sorcery, my lord. It's correction. She told him, and his wolf believed her, and it caught hold. But she can only hold him with her body in the room. To fix it, you'd have to write it, said Verity. You'd have to write it, Hester agreed. In the roll, in front of witnesses, with the mother's name spoken aloud by the registrar of the Concord of Rolls. She let that sit. Which is Selwyn Ambrose, who cut the page out, and who this morning laid a charge of blood witchery against you before the Moot. There was one more thing that week, and it seemed at the time like nothing. On the 6th night, Verity found Roderick in the archive, with a thin, foreign-bound book open in front of him, and an expression like a man chewing gravel. It was a naturalist's monograph, mainland printed, sent up from the assay house at Blackfen with a trade shipment and never opened by anybody until now. A man spent 12 years watching wolves, he said. Real ones, not us. And everything we know is wrong. He turned the book around. For 100 years, the mainland scholars said a wolf pack is a ladder. Strangers thrown together, and they fight, and the strongest becomes the alpha. Our whole Concord is built on that. The rolls rank the lines rank the wolves. My house sits on top because a ladder must have a top. And the man who watched for 12 years? Says the ladder was an artifact of the cage. Roderick's finger tapped the page. Every one of those studies was done in enclosures. Unrelated animals penned together with no way out. Of course they fought. In the wild there is no ladder at all. A pack is a family, and the alpha is only the parents. We built a kingdom on the behavior of prisoners, and called it nature. Verity thought about the muster yard, and the bowl of stone, and the levels the crowd stood in. That would be a dangerous book to leave lying about, she said. Yes, said Roderick Halloway, and did not close it. The registrar moved on the 8th day. He came up the tower himself with 2 Concord men and a sheaf of parchment, and he was courteous and calm, and he laid the first sheet on the table in front of Verity with 2 fingers. Surrender of issue, he said. Sworn by Verity Ash, unlined in the year of the cold moon, renouncing all claim in blood or bond to any child of her body, in consideration of 4 silver marks received. He smiled. Your thumb is at the bottom, mistress, in red, quite clear. The print was clean and full and perfectly legible, with the whorl and the delta and a little scar-nick across the top of the ridge. That's not my thumb, she said. It is attested by... That's not my thumb, Verity said again, and she reached across and put her own hand flat on the parchment beside it, and turned it over, and let every man in the room look at the shiny blank pad of her right thumb, where 4 years of lye had eaten the ridges off entirely. Selwyn Ambrose's smile did not move at all, but his eyes went very briefly down and to the left, to the corner of the sheet, and Verity followed them, and saw the date written there in the same disciplined hand as the roll of issue. The document had been drawn up 11 weeks ago. 11 weeks. The week the boy stopped speaking. The week the passing bell first rang 9. He had not forged it 5 years ago to bury a scandal. He had forged it this autumn, when the fading began, because he had known exactly what the fading meant, and exactly who could stop it, and he had wanted her signature on a paper before anybody thought to look for her, which meant Selwyn Ambrose had been prepared, for 11 weeks, to let a 4-year-old boy die. Verity raised her head to say so, and the door of the chamber opened, and the young woman in the slate-gray sash of the bond warden's clerks stood there white-faced with a candle in her hand, the one who had watched from the gate arch on the coldest morning of the year. And she said, in a voice pitched for the whole room and aimed at nobody, "Registrar, there's a rider from Merrow Pass." Then, as Selwyn turned, she looked directly at Verity, and her lips moved without any sound in them at all. "Your son's name is in that book twice. The clerk's name was Delphine Merrow, and she was the dead Ilsa's younger sister, and she had been lying to the pack for 4 years and 3 months. She said so herself, standing in Hester Quill's archive at midnight, with her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles had gone the color of tallow, and she said it before anyone asked her a single question, the way people do when they have been rehearsing a confession so long that it has to come out whole or not at all. "I wrote the false entry," she said. "I was 19. I was a third-year clerk, and my sister could not carry a child, and my family's charters were pledged against a marriage that required an heir." She looked at the floor. "The registrar told me it was a kindness. He said the mother had signed away the pup. He said she'd been paid. He said," Verity repeated. "He showed me the paper." Delphine's voice cracked once and steadied. "I have thought about that paper every day since I learned to look at thumbprints properly, which was in my 4th year, which was 2 years too late." Roderick said, "You said the name is in the book twice." "It is. It was." Delphine finally looked up. "That is the part nobody understands, and it is the part that will hang the registrar if you can prove it. He did not simply invent an entry for my sister. He couldn't. There were witnesses to a birth at Coldwater on the 9th, the midwife, 2 porters, a Concord man on the road. A birth had happened, and it had been reported to the rolls before Ambrose could contain it. So it was written. Properly. In the disciplined hand, in the ruled book, on the 9th of the cold moon. Male, living, of the line of Ash, with the hook drawn in the margin. Hester Quill made a small, satisfied noise, like a woman hearing a lock turn. And then a second entry, 4 days later, on the 13th, in the same book, Delphine said, "Male, living, of the line of Merrow," which I wrote. Which means for 11 months this archive held a book in which 1 child was recorded twice under 2 mothers, and any clerk who counted the year's issue against the year's midwifery returns would have found the pack 1 pup richer than it had any right to be. "And then somebody took a razor to the 9th, said Roderick, "in the 3rd year, after Corin and Ilsa died on the Merrow Pass Road." Delphine swallowed. "I know when, because I was the one who noticed it gone. And I said nothing. For a year I have said nothing. And I have watched that child stop eating, and I have told myself there was no connection, and I have known there was." Verity looked at her for a long moment. Everyone in the room was waiting for her to say something unforgiving. She could feel it. Hester braced for it. Roderick already half turned away, as though to give her privacy for it. And Delphine Merrow standing there with her chin up, and her eyes wet, taking it in advance. "How old were you?" Verity said. 19. "I was 21. Verity turned her hands over and looked at the blank pads of her fingers. "The registrar showed you a paper and you believed the paper. Everyone in this pack believes the paper. That's what the paper is for." She raised her head. "You'll say all of that at the Moot, in front of them, out loud." Delphine Merrow started to cry, and did not stop for some time, and said yes. They had 11 days. The Moot of the Rolls convened at the first thaw, which was the ancient date, and Selwyn Ambrose had petitioned it on 2 heads, the finding of blood witchery against the unlined woman Verity Ash, and the finding of doubtful issue against the heir of High Cairn. It was the second one that mattered, and it took Hester Quill 4 days in the charter boxes to work out why. She laid it out on the long table on the 5th night. The mining concessions of the Blackfen silver-bind seams, 11 charters, each one a great stiff document with a lead seal the size of a fist. "You've been robbed for 4 years and never felt it," she told Roderick, "which is the finest kind of robbery. Explain it to me as though I were a soldier." "You are a soldier." She tapped the top charter. "Silverbind is the only thing this mountain has that the mainland assay house wants, and it wants it badly. It makes the solder that holds their machines together. The seams belong to the pack in common. But the working of them is let out by charter, and the charters are held in trust for the heir until his majority. And the trustee named in every one is—" "The Conquered of Rolls," said Roderick. "The Conquered of Rolls, who take a tithe on every ton hauled off this mountain for the administration of the trust." Hester's finger moved down the page. "Now, read the reversion clause." Roderick read it. Then he read it again, and his jaw worked. "Should the heir fail or be found of doubtful issue," he said, "the trust shall not revert to the pack, but shall vest absolutely in the trustee to be administered for the common good in perpetuity." "In perpetuity," Hester agreed. "No tithe, no trust, no heir, just ownership." Verity said slowly, "So the boy is worth more to them dead." "The boy is worth more to them unlined," said Hester. "Dead is untidy. Dead makes a martyr and a great deal of noise. Unlined is quiet. Unlined is a finding of the moot, entered in a book, unappealable, and the seams change hands with nothing spilled but ink." She sat back. "And the beauty of it, my lord, is that the registrar did not have to do anything. He only had to be the man who chose, 4 years ago, which lie to write down. Everything since has simply been him waiting for the lie to ripen." Roderick stood at the window for a long while with his back to the room. 11 weeks, he said. He drew up her surrender 11 weeks ago because he knew what the fating was, and he knew who could stop it. He has sat at my table. He has taken my hand. He has told me to prepare a successor. He turned around. "Hester, if I put a spear through him tonight, does the boy live?" "No," said Hester Quill. "If you put a spear through him tonight, the moot convenes anyway, and a dead registrar's findings stand, and the seams vest in the Concord, and you hang for it, and the child fades in a fortnight. The only thing that saves that boy is a name spoken aloud into that book by the authority that keeps it." She looked at him without pity. "You cannot kill your way out of a filing system, my lord. Nobody ever has." The 11 days were the best of Verity's life, and she knew it while they were happening, which is rare. She moved into the North Tower. Nobody signed anything. The guard on the door simply stopped being on the door, and a cot appeared by the fire. And then the cot went unused because Bram would not sleep unless she was on the outside edge of the great carved bed with one hand somewhere on him. He came back the way ice goes off a stream. Silently, then all at once. On the 3rd day, he ate 2 bowls of barley and a heel of bread, and asked why everyone was being so strange. On the 5th day, he got out of bed on his own, and fell down, and was furious about it. On the 7th day, he took Verity's ruined hand in both of his, and turned it over, and studied the shiny blank places with a scientist's frown and said, "Does it hurt?" And she said, "Not any more." And he said, "Then it's fine," and let go, and that was the whole conversation. And Verity had to go and stand in the stairwell for a minute. He did not know she was his mother. They had agreed on that. Hester had been immovable about it, because a child who knew could be questioned, and a child who was questioned could be made to say the things sideways in front of the wrong people. So Verity was the woman who was there. She plaited his hair badly. She taught him the dyer's counting rhyme from Blackfen, which had 11 verses and got dirtier as it went, and had to stop it at 6. She let him win at Knucklebones twice, and then stopped letting him, and he liked her better for it. And Roderick came up in the evenings. He came with his sleeves rolled, and the day's ink still on his hands, and he sat on the floor with his back against the bedpost, because the chairs in the North Tower were made for physicians, and he told the boy the day's business in absurd detail: the grain returns, the argument about the bridge, the man from the assay house with the ridiculous hat. Bram fell asleep to it every night, which was, Verity understood, entirely the point. On the 9th night, with the boy asleep between them, Roderick said quietly, "I have to tell you a thing, and after I tell you, you may want to leave this mountain and take him with you, and I will give you horses if you do. Say it." He took a folded packet from inside his coat. 6 letters. The paper was the cheap gray stock of the Coldwater dye sheds, and the hand was young and slanted and impatient. "Hester found these under a floor," he said. "My brother wrote them and never sent them. They are addressed to me." Verity read them by firelight with her son breathing beside her, and the world she had lived in for 5 years came apart in her hands. "Brother, I am going to tell you a thing you will not forgive, and I am going to tell it badly. I did not reject her. I stood on that stone and said the words because the registrar came to me the night before with a page out of the roll of descent and laid it on the table and told me to read it, and I read it, and Roderick, our mother's line is a forgery. It was made in our grandfather's time. Her whole descent, the Pharaoh line, 4 generations of it, the thing every claim of ours stands on, was written into the book by a registrar named Ambrose for a consideration, because our grandfather had the spears and not the blood. It is a made thing. We are a made thing. Ambrose the elder wrote us into being, and Ambrose the younger keeps the page in a seal box in Blackfen, and he showed me the corner of it and put it away again. He said, 'Reject the dyer's girl and wed the Merrow woman, and the charters come into the house, and the page stays in the box.' He said, 'Refuse me, and by the second thaw there is no house, there is no king. There is a soldier's grandson on a hill with no line, and every pack from here to the assay house will be at your brother's throat inside a season.' So I learned the words, and I said them. And she stood there and took it. And I have not slept a whole night since. The 4th letter said, 'I have found where they took him. He is in my own house.' He is in my own house, Roderick. He is under Ilsa's name, and Ilsa did not know it either until last month, and she has not stopped weeping since. She is a decent woman married into a crime. We are going to Blackfen to the assay house, to lodge the true page with the mainland assayers, because the Concord cannot burn what the mainland holds a copy of. And when it is lodged, I will bring Verity Ash up this mountain, and I will say every word of it out loud in the muster yard, and they can strike me off if they like. I would rather be nobody with her than king of a forgery. We ride for the pass on the 11th. The rockfall on the Merrow Pass road had come down on the 11th. Verity read the last letter twice. Then she folded them all, and set them on the coverlet and put her hand flat on top of them, and sat very still, because if she moved, she was going to make a sound and the boy was sleeping. "The pass," she said at last. 60 feet of scree off a face that had stood since my grandfather's time. Roderick's voice was almost gentle. "The Concord's own surveyors certified it an accident. I signed the finding. I was 29, and my brother was dead, and a man I trusted put a paper in front of me and told me where to sign, and I signed it, and I have signed every paper that man has put in front of me for 11 years. Roderick, there is more, and you should have all of it at once." He looked at her steadily. "If those letters are true, then my mother's line is a forgery, which means my own claim is void, not weakened, void. Corin's claim was void, which means Bram's claim through Corin was always void, whatever mother he had. The only thing that has ever made me king of this mountain is that Selwyn Ambrose decided 40 years ago to write it down." Verity understood then what he had been carrying up 91 steps every evening for 9 nights. "You can't expose him," she said slowly, "without unmaking yourself. No. Every proof that saves my son ends your house. Yes, said the Alpha King of High Cairn. And I have known it since Tuesday, and I want you to know that I have thought about it honestly, and that I considered the other road for one entire night. He looked at the sleeping boy. Then he woke up on the 5th day, and fell over, and swore at the floor in his father's exact voice, and the road closed. Verity did not say anything for a while. What did the second letter say? She asked. You didn't let me read the second. He hesitated. Then he handed it to her, and it was 3 lines long. She has a mark on her wrist like a hook. If anything happens to me, find it. Everything true about my life is on the back of that woman's hand. They laid the plan out over the last 2 days, and it was not a plan for a battle, and Otho Kemp hated it. The Moot could not be stopped. Good. They would not stop it. Delphine Merrow would testify to writing the false entry. Nessa Fenn, the midwife, had been found at her sister's croft in Blackfen, 68 years old and half-blind, and so relieved to be caught that she wept on the doorstep, and she would testify to the rag and the bitter and the bundle of stones. Hester Quill would produce the Razored Stub and the Reversion clauses. Corin's letters would be read aloud by the king himself. And the true page, the pharaoh forgery, the page out of the Roll of Descent, the one thing that proved the whole architecture, was in a seal box in the registry's counting house at Blackfen, 4 miles down the mountain, behind a door with 3 locks. We do not have it, said Roderick. We will have to make him produce it, which he will only do if he believes producing it destroys me faster than concealing it does. You want him to think he's winning, said Hester. I want him to be winning, said Roderick, right up until the moment it stops mattering. On the last night before the Moot, Verity climbed the 91 steps at the 11th hour with a candle and stopped 4 steps from the top, because the door of the North Tower room was standing open and there was no light in it. The bed was empty. The coverlet was thrown back. The window stood wide with the frost broken away from the frame in a rough half-circle, the way frost breaks when a shutter is forced from the outside, and the cold coming through it was the cold of a mountain at the first thaw, and on the floorboards under the sill, small and dark and exactly the size of a 4-year-old's bare heel, there was one wet print, already drying at the edges. On the pillow, folded once, was a strip of parchment with the conquered seal. The heir will attend the Moot in the registrar's keeping, as is proper for a minor of doubtful issue. Come alone, mistress. Bring the letters. Verity did not go alone, and she did not bring the letters, and she was down the switchback road to Blackfen before Roderick Halloway knew she had gone. She brought Hester Quill, who was 73 and rode a mule and complained the entire 4 miles, and she brought Delphine Merrow. The 3 of them reached the registry counting house at Blackfen an hour before dawn and knocked at the front door like people with an appointment. He said alone, Delphine whispered. He said a great many things, said Verity. The counting house was a square gray building with a lead roof and a smell of sealing wax that reached the street. A porter let them in because Delphine's sash said he had to. In the great tallying room, under a ceiling of hanging brass scale pans, 40 clerks sat at 40 desks with candles just being lit, and every one of them looked up. Selwyn Ambrose came down the stairs in his traveling cloak, with a locked seal box under one arm, and behind him, holding a Concord man's hand and wearing somebody's cut-down coat over his nightshirt, was Bram Halloway. The boy saw her. "Verity," he said, in the flat, outraged voice of a 4-year-old who has been woken twice in one night. "They took me out the window." "I know. It wasn't even a good climb." Selwyn Ambrose stopped on the 4th stair and looked at the 3 women and did the arithmetic, and Verity watched him do it. He was not afraid. That was the thing that struck her. He was a tidy man in a good cloak standing above his 40 clerks, and he was not afraid of her at all, because in his whole life nothing had ever come at him except through paper, and he owned all the paper. "Mistress Ash," he said, "you've brought an audience." "I've brought witnesses," said Verity. "There's a difference, and you know it better than anyone alive." He offered her the bargain in front of everybody, which she had counted on. It was a good bargain in its way, the kind that had worked on better-placed people than her for 200 years. He laid it out with the ease of a man reciting a price list. The boy would live. Nobody wanted a dead child. Dead children were noise. The Moot would find the heir of doubtful issue. The trust would vest where the trust was meant to vest. The boy would be fostered on the coast under a decent name, and Verity Ash would have the 4 silver marks the surrender said she'd already had, plus 40 more, and a passage south. "He'll be gone by summer," Verity said. "He will be well cared for." "He'll be gone by summer, Registrar, and you know precisely why. Because your grandfather's registry struck the word for it out of the language." She did not raise her voice. 40 clerks had stopped pretending to work. "The Unmothering. Say it in your own house, in front of your own men, and tell them it isn't real." Selwyn Ambrose's hand tightened on the seal box. "You have no idea," he said, "what you are pulling down." "No, but you do." Verity took 1 step forward. "That's why you carried that box down 4 flights of stairs at 5 in the morning, instead of leaving it in a vault with 3 locks. There's only one thing in this world that frightens you, and it isn't me. It's being in a room where that box is opened, and you are not the man who decides what the pages mean." The Moot convened in the muster yard of Cairn at midday, because the ancient date is the ancient date, and the bowl of grey stone filled with wolves the way water fills a bowl. They came up from Blackfen and Coldwater, and the crofts on the Merrow road, because a Moot of the Rolls had not been called in 19 years, and because the whisper had gone round that the heir was walking. Verity stood on the flagstones where she had knelt 11 days earlier. The stones were wet now. The thaw had started in the night. Water ran under the ice in the gutters, and the whole mountain made a low, continuous sound, like something turning over in its sleep. Bram stood beside her with his hand in her hand, and would not be moved from it by anyone. And Roderick Halloway came down into the yard and up onto the Moot stone without his spear. That was the first thing the pack noticed, and a sound went through the terraces. He wore no mail and no marten, and he carried nothing at all in either hand. And he stood in front of 500 wolves, and the Concord of Rolls, and the factor of the mainland assay house. A small dry man in a ridiculous hat, sent up by Hester Quill's letter of 3 weeks past, who required clean title on 11 charters, and had been promised he would get it today. And he said, "Before the registrar reads his findings, I lay a question before the Moot, and it is a question about myself." Selwyn Ambrose said sharply, "My lord." "The Moot is convened, registrar. You convened it." Roderick did not look at him. "By the law of the Concord, when the descent of any wolf is challenged before a Moot, the registrar shall produce the roll of descent entire and unbroken, that the challenge may be answered from the record. Is that the law?" Silence. "Is that the law?" "That is the law," said Hester Quill, in a voice that carried like a dropped plate. "Then I challenge the descent of Roderick Halloway," said the Alpha King of Cairn. "Through his mother, of the Pharaoh line, 4 generations, entered in the roll of descent in the year of the broken ice. I say that entry is a forgery. I say it was written for money by a registrar named Ambrose. I say my house has sat on this mountain for 3 generations on a page somebody sold my grandfather." He turned, finally, and looked down at the small, tidy man in the good cloak. "Produce the roll of descent, registrar, entire and unbroken. I am waiting." Verity watched Selwyn Ambrose understand. It took perhaps 4 seconds. The little inward flinch of a man reaching for a weapon and finding the sheath empty. The page in his box had never been worth anything on its own. It had been worth everything as a secret, a knife whose whole power lay in never being drawn. And the man he had held it over had just walked out in front of 500 people and named it aloud. Now it was not a knife. It was evidence of a crime with his own family's name on it. "There is no such page," Selwyn said. "Then produce the roll and show us." "The roll is at Blackfen. The roll is under your arm," said Delphine Merrow. It came apart quickly after that, not in a single blow, but the way a wall comes down, one stone pulled, and the rest going all at once under its own weight. Delphine Merrow testified first, because she had asked to, saying she would not stand behind a dead woman or a live one. She told the yard she had written a false entry at 19, had known it false within 2 years, and had said nothing for 4. She did not soften any of it. She named her own sister. When she stepped down, her hands shook so badly she could not undo her sash, and Verity did it for her. Nessa Fenn was carried up in a chair, half blind, and told the yard about a rag and a bitter smell and a bundle of stones, and about the 8 silver marks she had taken and spent on a roof. Hester Quill held the roll of issue open above her head and walked the length of the Moot stone so the front ranks could see the Razored Stub with their own eyes, then read out the Reversion clause of the 11 charters in a flat classroom voice, twice, until the terraces began to make a noise like a hive, and Roderick read his brother's letters. He read all 6, badly, stopping twice. He read the line about the dyer's girl standing there and taking it. He read I would rather be nobody with her than king of a forgery, and the yard was so quiet that Verity could hear water running under ice. He read the date. We ride for the pass on the 11th. Then he looked up and said, The Concord surveyors certified that rockfall an accident. I signed the finding. I would like the Moot to appoint someone who is not me and not the Concord to look at that face again in the spring. And at last, under the compulsion of the Moot and the flat commercial stare of a small dry man who required clean title, Selwyn Ambrose set the seal box on the Moot stone and unlocked it. 2 loose leaves inside. One was the forged pharaoh descent, 40 years old, the ink gone brown. 4 generations of a family that had never existed, written in a dead man's disciplined hand. The other was a single page of vellum, razored from a binding, ruled in red, dated the 9th of the cold moon. Male, living, of the line of Ash. And in the left margin, drawn small and neat, a hook with a tail, and through the tail, a running thread. He had kept it. 4 years he had kept it, because a hostage is only useful alive. Selwyn Ambrose was permitted to speak, because the Moot permitted everyone to speak, and he spoke well. Verity had known he would. He did not deny the pages. He was far too clever for that. He stood with the whole architecture of his life lying open on the flagstones, and told the pack that everything they were about to tear down was the only thing keeping them from each other's throats. Look at the terraces you are standing on, he said. You did not build those levels. There has always been a top, and there has always been a bottom, and the only question any pack has ever answered is whether the latter is settled by ink or by teeth. My house chose ink. You may find our ink dishonest. You will find teeth worse. Strike the rolls, and by midsummer you will have 11 claimants on this mountain and a war over a hole in the ground. I did not invent the latter. I only kept it in a book. It was a good speech. Verity watched the middle terraces waver. Roderick Halloway let the silence sit for a moment. Then he took a thin, foreign-bound book out of his coat. A man on the mainland spent 12 years watching wolves, he said. Real ones. He watched what they do when nobody is keeping a book. He opened it. Every study our Concord was built on was made in enclosures. Strangers penned together with one food dish and no way out. And in the pen they fought, and a ladder appeared, and the scholars wrote down that a ladder is what wolves are. He looked up. It isn't. In open country there is no ladder. A pack is a family, a mother, a father, their young of 3 seasons. And the ones we call alphas are only the parents, and there is nothing whatever to climb. The ladder is not nature, Registrar. The ladder is the cage. You did not keep the ladder in a book. You built the pen. Then you told 500 people that the shape of the pen was the shape of their souls, and charged them a tithe to be told where they stood in it. He closed the book. I have stood at the top of your ladder my whole life. I am telling you it has no top. It only has a page, and the page is a lie, and I am the lie, and I am done. They stripped Selwyn Ambrose of the registry by voice, in the yard, in the space of about 4 minutes. He was not killed. Verity had thought she would want that, and found when the moment came that she did not. And in any case, Hester pointed out with some asperity that a dead registrar could not tell them which other entries he had sold. He was set to the archive under guard, to write out in his own hand every falsification he had made or inherited, for as long as it took. And the archive is a cold room, and there are 200 years of it, and Hester Quill checks his work. Then the yard turned, all of it at once, to the last piece of business. There was no registrar. So the Moot appointed one by shouting, and the shouting was for the old woman with the gray rope of hair, who had kept the archive for 40 years. And Hester Quill came up onto the Moot stone with the roll of issue under her arm, and the razored leaf in her hand, and looked profoundly annoyed about the whole thing. She set the book open on the stone. She smoothed the loose page back into its gutter with 2 thumbs. "This is not sorcery," she announced to 500 people, "and I will not have it called sorcery afterward. This is a correction of the record. Bring the child." Bram came, holding Verity's hand, and looked at the enormous crowd and said, "Is this the boring part?" "Yes," said Hester Quill. "Kneel down, mistress. Not for me. For your knees." Verity knelt on the wet flagstones where she had knelt 11 days before, in the same place, in front of the same 500 people, and took her son's face in both of her lye-ruined hands. Hester Quill read from the recovered page, in a voice like a bell in a stone room, entered on the 9th of the cold moon. Male. Living. Born at Coldwater to Verity of the line of Ash, and to Corin of the house of Holloway, who did not deny him. She lifted her head. "Speak his name, mother. It's yours to speak. Nobody in this yard has ever had the right to speak it, but you." Verity leaned down, and put her mouth to her son's forehead, and said it. The wind came off the thaw, along the whole eastern terrace. On 500 coats and cloaks and hoods, the melt frost went to fine white powder and lifted at once, and the yard filled with it, a slow, bright suspended snow going up instead of down. And under it, Bram Holloway made a small, startled sound and grabbed 2 fistfuls of Verity's sleeve and held on. The mark came up on the back of his neck and stayed. What they did afterward took a year and was mostly extremely dull, which Hester Quill said was the surest sign it was working. The Concord's trusteeship over the Silverbind seams was dissolved, and the charters vested in the pack in common, the mainland factor witnessing, since he required clean title and did not much care who held it. The tithe went to the commons, a bridge, a school at Blackfen, and, at Verity's insistence, a proper flue and 6 new vats for the high Cairn washhouse, so that no woman would lose the ends of her fingers again for half a wage. The rolls were not burned. Verity argued hardest against that, and won, using Delphine's argument. A book that can be burned is a book somebody can rewrite. They were made public instead, read aloud 4 times a year, and the ranking of lines was struck out entirely. The registry now records who was born and to whom, and nothing else. It does not say what that is worth. Hester had it carved over the archive door. And the crown. Roderick Holloway resigned it that same afternoon and could not take it back, because the line it descended through had never existed. What the Moot did instead, 6 weeks later, after a great deal of argument and one memorable fistfight, was choose him, by voice, for a term of 9 years, subject to the Moot. He is not the Alpha King anymore. Nobody has settled on what to call him. Bram calls him Roderick, which he seems to prefer. He asked her at the end of that summer, on the Scree slope above Coldwater, where she had gone to dig up a bundle of stones and put them somewhere that was not a grave. He came up with a shovel over his shoulder and helped, and afterward they sat on the warm rock and looked down at the dye sheds. "I want to say a thing badly," he said, "and I want you to let me finish before you answer, because I've been arranging it for a month and it will fall apart if you interrupt. Go on, then. There is no right in this, Roderick said. That's the whole of it. My brother stood on a stone and said words the registry put in his mouth, and it cost you 5 years and cost him his life, and I am not going to stand anywhere and say words somebody has approved. There's no line to join, no bond to register. I have nothing to offer you that a book confers. He turned his hands over, the burn scar white across the back of one. I'd like to be where you are. That's all of it. You may say no, and I will still be at that table on Thursdays because of the boy, and nothing about your position or his changes by one hair. I've had Hester write that down and lodge it, so you needn't take my word. Verity laughed. She had not expected to. You had it lodged? I've learned some things this year. She looked down the mountain for a while. There was a haze off the seams where the new works were going in, and somewhere below, a boy who could climb again was very probably up something he shouldn't be. Ask me in spring, she said. That's a year. It's 8 months, and I've had 5 years of being told what I am by people holding paper. I'd like to spend 8 of them deciding for myself. She glanced at him. You said I could say no. This isn't no. I know what it isn't, said Roderick Halloway, and looked absurdly pleased, and picked up the shovel. They wrote Verity Ash's name back into the rolls on the warmest morning of the following year, and she did not kneel, and she did not watch a scribe do it. Hester Quill made her write it herself. That was the new practice, entered in the standing orders in Hester's crabbed hand. The named shall set down their own name, or shall name aloud the one who sets it down for them. Verity's fingers never came back. The ends of them were still shiny and blank as candle wax, and the pen slipped twice. And the letters came out large and crooked and childish, and the ink pooled at the end of the last stroke, and sat there glossy as a beetle's back. It was a great deal of ink to spend on a laundress. She looked at it a long moment, that black wet name on the ruled page, 4 lines below a bar of ink somebody had drawn through her once. Bram was hanging off the archive table on his elbows, 5 years old and enormous with it, watching her do it. Is that all it takes? He said. Writing it down? And Verity thought about a razor drawn twice through a gutter, and a bundle of stones on a frozen slope, and a tidy man in a good cloak who had never in his life had to touch anyone to ruin them. No, she said. That's all it takes to undo it. Writing it down is only how they hold you. She capped the ink. What it takes is somebody standing close enough to say your right name out loud, and meaning it. The boy considered this with a frown. Like the kiss, he said. Like the kiss. He nodded, satisfied, and went off to climb something. Here is the question they still argue about at High Cairn, in the wash-house and on the terraces, and at the school at Blackfen. And it is not settled, and probably never will be. If a page in a book can make a child fade, and a mother's mouth on his forehead can call him back, then how many of us are only slowly disappearing because nobody has ever said our true name out loud? And who, exactly, has been keeping the book?